So, welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight. And today, my guest once again is the wonderful Wayne McRoy, and we are going to talk about the Brotherhood of the Snake, a very, very ancient secret society. And yeah, we will see what will surface here. So, Wayne, welcome to the show. And how are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me back on. Always a pleasure to speak to you, especially about things esoteric and things about the various secret society groups. And the Brotherhood of the Snake is one of the oldest ones that there is. It's one of the preliminary mystery schools that goes way back into antiquity. And of course, the things going on today directly tie back to these secret society groups and the lineage that they have from ancient times. So we shouldn't be surprised with the state of the world right now, because I think we agree at this point that this stuff's all been telegraphed long ago to us. We could expect these kind of things to always seem to occur. So we're in a little bit of geopolitical turmoil right now in the world, and people are rightfully concerned about it. But of course, it's all part of their plans that they've had it in place from time immemorial, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And so, before we start with the subject in general, can you explain to us the exoteric teachings and the esoteric teachings? Because I have a feeling that the peasants, us, we are usually getting fed the exoteric teaching, and that has to be enough for us. What say you?
Well, of course, they always break down these ideas into the exoteric and the esoteric. The esoteric is the portion of this that they teach is for the initiates and the adepts only, the people who understand, who are part of the brotherhood and who are initiated into their cult. And I'll call it a cult because essentially that's kind of what it is. And then the exoteric version of things we're handed, it's for the public, for the masses, for whom they call the profane. And that's you and I. That's the ones that aren't read into their programs and read into their secret society groups. So they always have had this type of dualistic teaching going on, where they teach the masses one thing, and then the adepts or the brotherhood are taught another thing. And a lot of this ties back to the old mythologies and the old religious structures in antiquity. People may be familiar with, like, the cult of Bacchus or these various other cults, the cult of Dionysus. All these things, if you look back into the ancient world, well, people are taught you had these people that worshiped these gods, and they did various things and performed various ceremonies and stuff to appease these gods. Do you really think ancient people were that dumb? Like, think about it, that they believed in such and such a god here and they worshiped that god. Well, here's the thing, a lot of that ties back to symbolism, the language of symbolism that was conveyed through the mystery schools. So they presented this exoteric teaching to the masses, who by and large adopted these traditions and these ceremonies to these various gods. And of course, we see this looking back from our modern day as, well, look at these people. They worshiped all these gods. They believed all of these strange things. And, this is what they did. Well, that's the exoteric version of it. The esoteric version, there's secret messages conveyed by the various symbols that are represented by these gods. And in many instances, these gods that are presented, well, they represent different aspects of different energetic potentials within the natural world. So that's what they represent. It doesn't represent an actual physical, uh, personified being the way they have it. It's an archetype that was leveraged upon by those secret priestcrafts behind the scenes, which were the mystery schools, which were the adepts of the mystery schools behind these various teachings. So this adapted through different places and different cultures as different types of cults, like the cult of Bacchus, the cult of Dionysus, and it's endless. And you could trace it back to ancient Egypt as well. You had the Osiris, Isis, and Horus mysteries, and all of these things, all of these different gods that were allegedly worshipped. But that was only the exoteric version that we've been given. You see, behind the scenes, those symbols represent something else to the adepts. And the priestcraft behind the veil, who directed these things, and they were the ones who, across these different cultures and these different areas of the world, they taught some core teachings that were unified behind all these various masks or facades of these different gods. And they were teaching a lot of the same things. And this ties back to what we can call, and what has commonly been called by some, as this Brotherhood of the Snake, or the Brotherhood of the Serpent, which was one of the original mystery schools teaching a lot of these things that we can find. Now, they go back further than written history can show us. This stuff goes back into antiquity, and some would argue it goes back to Atlantis or Lemuria or places and times before that even. We're not sure exactly where this originates, but this is one of the historically traceable original groups we could trace. It's called the Brotherhood of the Snake, or the Brotherhood of the Serpent, or the Brotherhood of the Dragon. And this was
Dragon.
one of the original mystery schools. And essentially what the symbol represents is, well, a lot of different things. The serpent represents wisdom. It represents death and rebirth, because a snake sheds its skin. And a dragon, of course, this represents power. It represents many different things. There's a different occult levels you could read this on too. There's even studies on what they call the occult anatomy of man, where it correlates with the spinal column of man too. And you have this kundalini force that goes up and down the spine, which is represented in art and literature as a serpent. So all these things tie together, and it all has to do with this secret doctrine, or these secret teachings of the mystery schools that seem to have underlied all of the ancient religions and philosophies. So you had a small group of people who maybe discovered some knowledge or learned some different knowledge that they kept hidden from the masses. And they did this just for the sake of maintaining some type of power or control over the masses. Because if you know something somebody else doesn't, that gives you a type of power over them in a certain way, doesn't it? And that's one of the primary reasons why they've always used secrecy as one of the greatest mind control tools ever conceived. That's what secrecy does. It's a mind control tool. Even if you don't know something that somebody else doesn't, if you could convince them that you do know something that they don't, then that gives you a type of power over that person. So this has been manipulated by these secret society groups from time immemorial, even up unto today. And the same thing can be said. It can be seen across time and culture, all different times and cultures, across many of these secret society groups, across philosophies and religions around the world. There's always been this secret control group behind the veil. They like to call it the veil. They keep themselves hidden, out of sight. These secret controllers of things that pull the strings. They don't like to do their dirty work out there in the light of day. They do it behind the scenes, and they have other people do stuff for them. So that's essentially a breakdown of where this all traces back to. So one of the earliest lineages we could find of these mystery schools is, of course, this Brotherhood of the Snake. So that's where it lies, and a lot of that leverages on the symbolism of the snake motif itself, and that's why they call themselves that.
Yeah. When we dig into the subject, then of course names like Ea come up, and that he was the one that set up the Brotherhood in order to teach humanity, which was not allegedly wanted by the rest of the so-called gods, and then it morphed into something else. So would you agree that maybe there is, yeah, how shall I put this? Enki, and that it could come from the Anunnaki?
Well, it all depends upon, like, what's your take exactly on the Anunnaki. I can't say for certain what that truly was. We are presented with these stories
Yeah.
about the Anunnaki, and we are presented with this old mythology, the Sumerian and the Babylonian mythology and stuff like that, that relate to these gods, Enki and Ea, and all of these different ones like that. Well, these, in my view, are archetypes. Okay, and that's what a lot of this relates back to. These are symbols, they're archetypes, they're a type of secret language used by these controllers, by this secret priestcraft behind the scenes to manipulate people. The archetype is something that's inherent in the human condition. Our unconscious mind recognizes the archetype, but our conscious mind does not. So by leveraging these archetypes, they could influence our unconscious mind in a subconscious way, which eventually translates into a change in conscious behavior. So that's largely what they've done, because we inherently recognize these archetypes. It's something primal in the human spirit, in the human being. Now, scientists have tried to explain some of this as genetic memory, epigenetic memory, the quantum information field. I love that term too. But they've tried to describe this in many ways. A lot of the occultists would call it the Akashic record or ancestral memory, things like that. Here's the thing, that regardless of what you call it, everybody seems to agree that this thing, this concept exists one way or the other. They just call it different things and maybe have a little slight difference in description of it. So that being the case, this is what that harkens upon. Now, were there ancient beings from somewhere else, some gods or aliens or whatever you'd like to call them, that came here and seeded humanity here and produced us as a slave race? I don't know if that's the case. I don't think so. The evidence, in my view, that I've seen doesn't seem to lend credence to that idea. But of course, the controllers, the dark occultists who control things in this world, would certainly like us to believe that, because if we were destined to be a slave race, well, doesn't that just fit their paradigm perfectly? That's what they want for us to believe, that we are this slave race. So therefore, accept your lot in life and be slaved out to these controllers, to this small one percenters, this small group of people that runs things. And that's kind of my take on all of that. I don't know, and I can't claim to have the answers as to the truthfulness of some of those claims. I have heard the Anunnaki tales and stuff like that before, and a lot of that's derived from Zecharia Sitchin's work, which, let's face it, has been considered to be problematic by some people. So that being the case, I kind of have my doubts as to the veracity of some of the claims made there. But it would not surprise me in the least to know that there's a reason that we've been presented these stories. And of course, that is to hold up that archetypal notion that perhaps we are a slave race on a prison planet. All this ties back to the Gnostic teachings, too, by the way. So we have all of that. So they would like us to believe that perhaps we are just here to be slaved out to this superior species, this superior group here that are the controllers of this place. So I know that's a mouthful, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, and that's perfectly okay. You are entitled to it. And I would say um, it remains to be seen how advanced they really are. Because, if you have a mental strive to enslave others, that to me is not per se a sign of spiritual advancement.
Oh, I agree with you there, but they do claim to be so far spiritually advanced beyond us. These
Mhm.
these dark occultists at the top of the power structure and those that run things, those within these secret society groups, see, that's their thing. They're all about this alleged spiritual evolution, and they think that they're beyond a lot of this stuff. But when you look at the actual intention behind the things they do, you realize that does not sound like a spiritually advanced person doing that. And all you have to do is look at the example of like an Aleister Crowley or something to really flesh out that entire concept. Look at the things he had done. And he claimed to be so spiritually advanced and evolved that he considered himself beyond the capacity of normal human beings. And see, that's the thing. When you get involved with many of these secret society groups and many of this ritual magic and stuff like that, these ways of thinking, oftentimes what it leads to is it leads to a place where they think at some point that they cross the abyss, and that their meaning of cross the abyss, that means that now they are not bound by the limitations of morality and ethics. So they're beyond that. So they consider themselves beyond that. So they have no compunction with making slaves of people. And all you got to do, like I said, is look at Aleister Crowley as an example of this, because in his religion that he founded called Thelema, that was allegedly channeled from a higher being to him, he says, "Do as thou will is the whole of the law." So it's all about the individual will, the individual practitioner's will, the magician's will. And if his will is stronger than others, then anything's permissible. And that's what they teach, and that's what they believe at the topmost levels of these secret society groups today. And a lot of this has derived back from the ancient times, from the Brotherhood of the Snake, and from these various mystery schools. And the thing is, these mystery schools haven't always taught this tainted and evil intentioned way of doing things. It's just through the years and through the millennia that those people who were the alleged keepers of the secrets of the ages, they had their own personal agendas. And what they wound up doing is they twisted and contorted and perverted many of these teachings to use them and utilize them in a way against people where it gave them power and leverage over people. So they used it for purposes of control, for purposes of power, and meeting their own agendas that they wanted met, their own needs, their own wants. They wanted to become godlike, and they saw this as a way of doing that by using some of these secrets that they knew that other people didn't as a means of control. And of course, that definitely aligns with what ultimately culminated in Aleister Crowley claiming that "do as thou will is the whole of the law." And that's where we're at today. So this whole notion has it kind of evolved in and of itself through the years and become very twisted and contorted in the modern view. So do I believe that everybody that gets involved with secret societies is bad? No. Most of them are good people who think they're getting involved with something good, and they think they're doing something that's good, until at some point they get in so deep they can't get out anymore. And then they just go with it because why not? So that's what seems to happen with regard to this stuff.
And the good-hearted people, many times, they do not climb the ladder in that secret society. And there will come a point when there is some initiation and they ask something creepy of them. And when they decline, what is being said to them is, yeah, brother, this is okay. Nobody should do that. For example, spitting on the cross. And yet, after that, they will notice that no matter how hard they study and what they do, they will never climb up in the hierarchy. Yeah, that is what happens to good-hearted people.
Precisely. They never proceed any further from there. And they only get actually pulled up the ladder from somebody inside on the other side. They have to be selected. They look for people who have certain traits that they want to elevate to that higher level. So a lot of that stuff is by invitation only. And a good example of that is the Freemasons and the Freemasonic 33rd degree. Well, that's only specially conferred to select people. And you don't get that without an invitation to do so. You don't get that without the pull up from the ones higher up in the hierarchy. So therefore, your training might stop there. Everything might stop right there for you at some point when you don't want to do those things that they see as being beneficial for the Brotherhood. That's the thing. Many of these people, they make blood oaths
Yeah.
they swear allegiance to this Brotherhood to do the things that they want them to, at the cost of perhaps even giving up their own lives. And that's the whole thing. If they betray the secrets of the order, well, then they'll be murdered in ritualistic fashion in many different ways. And, William Morgan is an example of this that we could look back in history and see. Absolutely. I think every scholar agrees he was murdered by the Freemasons for revealing their secrets. And so that's something you could look at the historical record and see. But, that's neither here nor there. That's all part of it. And that's the whole thing. What has happened in these groups is they've become so twisted and perverted that primarily at the topmost levels of these secret society groups and these occult fraternities, it's all evil all the time being promoted and done. And that's why I like to say that behind the scenes, people running things are dark occultists, because that most certainly is what they are. And it's undeniable if you actually go and explore these different topics and look at how the world is run and what the structure of the world looks like. And of course, relating to things going on here today, the secret society groups and the intelligence agencies and intelligence community are all interlaced and interconnected. Where do you think the intelligence community got their motifs from? Where do you think they got their operational standards from? From the secret society groups. They've been doing it a whole lot longer than the organized intelligence community. Of course, I'm talking Mossad, CIA, MI6, MI5, all of these different ones. There's intelligence agencies in every major nation on the earth, and they're all interconnected and interrelated. And even the occultists have in the past and continue to today work with the intelligence community. Aleister Crowley was a card-carrying member of MI5 or MI6. This is a known commodity. People could look this up. I don't remember if it was MI5 or MI6. I think it was the international one, which I could never get those straight, but it was one or the other that he was a card-carrying member of. So certainly they always have these occultists involved with this stuff. Same could be said L. Ron Hubbard, Jack Parsons. They were all involved with the intelligence community. They were proteges of Aleister Crowley. You have all of these different ones. Even more recently, you could look at people like Anton LaVey, I think, had some connections in the intelligence agencies, as well as Michael Aquino. He was most assuredly part of military intelligence. And of course, these are people that are very heavily related into these occult fraternities. So there's connections there all over the place, but people don't seem to think of it all the time. But it does
Yeah.
have everything to do with international politics.
Yeah. Anton LaVey, he was actually a photographer for the police. He photographed crime scenes, and he was at a hotline. He worked at a hotline where people could report crimes and so forth. So he was, funny enough, a very law and order type guy.
Yeah, and
And
that's the surprising thing. A lot of these occultists, they are very much law and order because, well, they want to have their jackboot thugs out there enforcing their will upon the others. So of course they like that kind of a thing when it suits them, of course.
yeah, of course. So some authors, they point out that the Brotherhood of the Snake split up into different cults and then invented our religion. Have you ever looked into that?
Well, I think that relates to the things that I started out the show here with, whereas you had all of these different cults of sorts back in the ancient times, where you had like Bacchus, the religion of Bacchus, Dionysus, all of these different ones, and they were international in scope. And pretty much, here's the thing: most of the ceremonial teachings and stuff like that, the acts of worship and everything, they focused on the same initial things in all these different groups. And the secret teachings behind the exoteric doctrine were all the same within the secret priestcraft. See, they interrelated. So even though they ostensibly broke up into these different groups, it was still the same teachings that primarily were given only to the adepts behind the scenes. So these were all adapted for various reasons to the various cultures where they were instantiated at the time. So you had this represented in this different way. Of course, here's the thing: our history is jacked with just as much as the news is. You've heard of fake news. Well, fake history is probably much worse. And we don't really know. We don't have the ability to know what exactly was going on in those societies and cultures at the time. Just this textbook edition that we're given in our education system, that these were, backwards people who were out there worshiping the sun and this kind of thing. And they were not as intelligent as we are today. And I don't think anything could be further from the truth. I think we're much dumber today than ancient man was. I don't think we give him enough credit for how advanced he was in his thinking, and probably technologically too. I don't doubt that there was a technological civilization here that we probably know nothing about today.
Yeah, well, they built the pyramids and we could not.
Precisely. They built all of these monuments that we just can't do today. Look at the Gothic cathedrals, even. Now, you're talking, these were allegedly built in the Dark Ages, when mankind was just backwards and struggling with diseases and the plague and all of this stuff, and everything was gloomy and cold and nasty, and we were in a mini ice age and all of this stuff, and everything was horrible, and people were just toiling, trying to produce enough food to live, and it was all poverty stricken and everything. But yet we have these massive cathedrals that are just monuments of art built in this era, and we have no idea how they did it, and we can't duplicate that today. So what does that tell you? I mean, there's so much of our history that has been just hidden from us, that we have no record of, that it's just unbelievable to think of the possibilities.
Hmm. But what you just said, fake news and fake history, it kind of plays into the entire subject, because if you cut a man, a woman, you cut them off from their roots, from real understanding. Where do I come from? What is this all about? You have a perfect slave.
That's right. And then you could just give them
You
whatever
tell
you
them anything.
You could tell them anything and make them believe it. I mean, I think George Orwell touched upon this in his book 1984. What did he say? I'm going to try and paraphrase it, but I'll probably butcher it. But he said, "He who controls the past controls the present, and he who controls the present controls the future." So that's the whole notion here. If you rewrite history to reflect whatever you want, well, then you control people in the present. And if you could control the people and the narrative in the present, then you could control the outcomes in the future. So that's essentially been handed to us by one Mr. George Orwell, otherwise known as Eric Blair, who was very much interconnected with, the Royal Society and various of those other people in positions of power in that time. So he was telling us a little something with that. So even though it was presented as a work of fiction, it certainly represented a lot of truths.
Yeah. So a name that also comes up with the Brotherhood of Snake is Akhenaton. And his palace, no, not the palace, the temple in Amarna was shaped like a cross. Do you think that Akhenaten was part of the Brotherhood?
Oh, absolutely no doubt in my mind,
Mhm.
because all of those ancient Egyptian pharaohs were allegedly initiated into the Brotherhood. They had to be in order to be pharaoh. So that being the case, I mean, this guy likely knew stuff, and there's a lot of interesting facts about Akhenaten that kind of defy what mainstream history would tell us about Akhenaten and about the things that were done in that era and how people lived during that time frame. So it's an interesting thing to look at that. The Egyptology, in and of itself, actually has become a thing that, well, it's kind of fraudulent on the face of it. Let's be real honest about it. The whole science of Egyptology was developed around this one culture, and a lot of what they present is based around one relic that they found. And of course, we're talking about the Rosetta Stone. So they made much of the translations of the hieroglyphs based upon their understanding of the Rosetta Stone, which was only partial and only represented three languages there. One was the original hieroglyphics, one was some kind of a new version of hieroglyphics, which they also didn't understand at the time, and the other was Greek. So, how much was really lost in translation there with this Rosetta Stone? And they used this to try to decipher the language and figure out what the symbols meant. And a lot of it was guesswork. Let's be honest about it. If you look back at it, a lot of it was guesswork and a lot of it was just compiled and pieced together to try to give some type of a narrative to those things that they found, those relics that they found related to Egypt and the stories that they knew that came out of Egypt. So a lot of the science of Egyptology was based around this, and it became its own form of a sub-discipline under archaeological studies and anthropological studies. Egyptology. Is there any other culture in the world that has their own branch of science named after them? Think about that. Is there Germanology? There's not. Is there Englishology? No, there's not. Just Egyptology. So this, in my estimation, this whole science of Egyptology was put forward for a reason. This was to establish this small group as an authority over this culture. And this was an important phase of our history that's probably been long forgotten by mankind. So they're controlling the entire narrative, the entire history of what happened in Egypt in this way, because they've used this science, they've adopted and adapted this science into being as the authority as to how Egyptian culture flourished and what happened and what the history thereof is. And a lot of it is based on a lot of speculation, and a lot of it's based on fraud. And it's all simply put in place to control the narrative. So this is what was established, and this is what we're told. And this is an important facet of our history, because if you trace things back, you always are able to trace things back to Egypt as one of the earliest cultures that we can look at in the modern era. And it was a model used by many of these groups in power today that have vested interest in maintaining the narrative. And of course, a lot of this relates back to this Brotherhood of the Snake, because largely the secret society groups leverage heavily off of the Egyptian mysteries and the Egyptian notion of things, especially the Freemasons. It all ties back to Egypt. So they've kind of made their own history and adapted their own belief systems to this history that they made up. And it's a lot to think about, and it's a lot to unpack. And were there notions of Egypt that were true? Probably. But I think there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that's been included in the science of Egyptology as well, to try to adapt what our thinking of this culture as having been should be today. So that's kind of where we're at here. And I think it's possible they were a more technologically advanced culture than we are. I think it's demonstrable. And I think there's a lot we haven't been told about their society and the structure of their society as well. Do I really think people worshipped the pharaohs and thought they were human gods back in ancient Egypt? No. I mean, that would be like saying, is President Biden a god? So think about that. Do you really think ancient man was that dumb to think, okay, this guy, this king, this royal fellow here, this leader, this political leader, well, he's a god. He's got power here. He could do supernatural things. He could control the rise and the fall of the river and this and that. Do you really think people were that dumb? I don't think so. So I think we've been handed a bill of goods by many of these people, and they're all about controlling the narrative. So this, once again, relates back to that thing Orwell told us. He who controls the past controls the present, and he who controls the present controls the future. So if they could make you believe this false notion of history that really wasn't, and it's basically the foundation of what our culture is today, they can make you believe anything. And Voltaire told us, he who could make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And that's where we're at in our science and our culture today. That's where we are. Even the notion of, let's even look at it from the notion of, where is it that we exist? Do we live on a globe flying through space, or are we on a flat plane? This is why the flat earth movement has really taken off in recent years, because you have to really think about this. If they lie about the very foundations of our civilization, what would make you think they wouldn't lie to you about the nature of the place that you live? If you don't even know where you
That
are,
doesn't
how do
gel
you
with
believe
me at
anything?
all.
What's that?
That doesn't gel with me at all. Mm-mm.
No, and I'm not saying it has to, but I'm just saying the whole notion has come about because if they lie about even the very foundational stuff, what
Mm-hmm.
makes you think for an instant they wouldn't lie to you about the nature of the reality that you live in? And that's the
Yeah.
whole, it's so hard to discern what's true and false these days
Mm.
because
That
of all
that
the
the earth
manipulation.
is not flat is not hard to discern. Honestly, it's not. definitely not. But is okay. Whoever likes to believe and investigate flat Earth, do it. I just don't wish to be proselytized.
And that's
Um, well,
understandable, but I'm saying that's why that notion has really taken off, because people are thinking if they lie to us about so much, why wouldn't they lie about that as well? And certainly
yeah,
they have.
yeah. Okay. So, but what I find interesting with Akhenaten, when I look at the depictions of him, he even has a serpentine look. You know, he has these spindly legs and arms, and this, yeah, oversized head. Then the eyes are somewhat creepy, and the jawline. So I'm really not surprised that I don't know if that was a birth defect or what it was. I find that Akhenaten, in the way he is depicted, he does not really look human.
No, and I agree with that notion. And a lot of that does tie back to this whole Brotherhood of the Snake idea, because they do like to claim that figures of royalty have some type of, I guess, a royal bloodline or something that associates back to this reptilian type notion. So, was
Mm.
this just an artistic representation of this guy with these snake like features just to give the connotation, yes, this is one of our guys, this is royalty, this is one of the initiates of the Brotherhood of the Snake? And was this just an artistic representation, or did the guy really look like that? And it's hard to say for sure, because I don't think, to my knowledge, the body of Akhenaten has ever been found. Of course, there has been claims that perhaps it has, and this ties back once again to the whole notion of Egyptology. Again, and somebody, if you're really interested in learning more about this, that knows a lot about it, is Freeman Fly. If you look up Freeman, he's done a lot of work relating back to Akhenaten, and it's really interesting stuff, because we do have these artistic representations of Akhenaten where he doesn't look quite normal or quite human, and there's been a lot of things said about Akhenaten, and perhaps that he was not completely human to some degree or another, that he was some type of a hybrid. This has been said by some researchers too. I don't know if there's any way to fully prove nor disprove any of that, but it is an interesting topic. And certainly, I would say, just based upon the things that we do know that have been brought forward, to get into a position as Pharaoh, you do have to be read into and initiated into the Brotherhood. So they do take some of their lineage back to this Brotherhood of the Snake kind of mentality. So
Mm.
we have that going on with Akhenaten for sure. And of course, Akhenaten made some really dramatic changes to the culture of Egypt, according to the Egyptologists and the history that we're handed about Egypt. So, that being said, this was an important figure, and this figure of Akhenaten is revered by many of these secret society groups, and there's a reason for that. What that reason is exactly, I can't say for certain. Is he a human alien hybrid, or was he like, just some guy they represented in this way so that they have this figure to harken back to? Was it an archetype that they were leveraging? I can't say for certain what that really is, what the true nature of that is. But what I do know is this is a figure that they do give reverence to in the secret society groups. And there's a reason for that. And maybe they're
Mm.
not forthcoming with that reason, but I think it does have very much to do with this old Brotherhood of the Snake.
Hmm. Yeah. And the initiation itself, that took place in the pyramids because they were not two.
No, they most certainly were not tombs, and that's another contrivance that our Egyptology and our history has handed us. Oh, they were elaborate tombs that the pharaohs built for themselves. Well, how come, by and large, they've never really found too many pharaohs actually in the tomb that they built for themselves? First and foremost, and second of all, like, how does that make any bit of sense? Especially when you look at this massive structure, and if you look at how it's laid out, if you know anything, if you've done any delving into these ancient mystery schools, the Brotherhood of the Snake and the like, you find out that much of the inside structure of these pyramids was crafted in a way where it emulated the old cave systems that they did their initiation rites in times past. So it was designed specifically as an initiation type of a temple of initiation. That's what these things were designed as. And some would say they were actually designed as free energy devices too. And I've done a
Mhm.
little bit of looking into that. And it may be based upon various geophysical aspects of it and geomancy aspects of it. If you look at geomancy, the magical notion of geomancy and ley lines and stuff like that, maybe there was something to it. Maybe it was some kind of an electromagnetic conductive thing with the capstone on top, because they used to have the capstones on top. And of course, they were all white in antiquity. The pyramids were bright white, and they had some kind of a coating on them in the past that may have had some electrical properties or something. So it's very possible they could have been some type of energy collector at some point. But I think
Mhm.
shifts in the structure of the earth may have changed some of the geospatial energy lines or ley lines that were attached there, and perhaps they have not been operating how they were intended from some point. So I don't discredit those types of notions either. Right now, I don't see any evidence to really support those claims, but it seems logical if you want to speculate about it. It seems logical that that could have been a thing. Perhaps they did have dual purposes. Because, like I said, we've been handed the history of Egypt largely by these Egyptologists, and they don't even tell us that kind of thing. That these pyramids, well, they used to be white, and they used to have the capstone on them, and you could see them. They gleamed in the,
Miles
from
away.
far, right. You could see the light reflected off of them from miles away, and that they were these shining beacons for people to see from a long ways off. So who knows? Like, who knows what they're not telling us? That maybe they do know in the auspices of these secret schools, the secret occult fraternities, the Brotherhood. Maybe they do know something more about it. They're not telling us. I don't know. I can't say. I don't have access to their records. Maybe there's something in the Vatican archives about it. Who can say? We've lost so much information through this distortion of history we've been handed. It's hard to know what's factual and what's not about these things. But we just know the narrative we've been handed by the mainstream.
Yeah. I also do not believe that, you know, the entire Alexandrian library was just lost. I think a lot of it found its place back to Rome. And yeah, and from there, later on in the Vatican, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. I'm not saying that no books were burned, but I have a hard time believing that everything burned.
Yeah, especially when knowledge is power. Do you really think that those people who were in the positions of power at that time, they wanted to lose all of that secret knowledge? I don't think so. I think they just picked it up and moved it elsewhere and, gave the facade that it all burned away so that they
Mm.
could maintain their control over those pieces of information. So the Vatican seems to be the logical repository for where this stuff may have wound up. Let's just face that as a fact.
Yeah, it could, theoretically, it could be in a different place as well, but I also think that the Vatican is a good candidate for that. So, do you know anything about the, let's say, dress code of the Brotherhood of the Snake? Because I read that we still have remnants of that. For instance, the monks, when they have these, what do you call these, hoodies, that actually goes back to the Brotherhood of the Snake. Do you know anything about that, their dress code?
Well, there are certain articles of clothing like that capuchin, I think that's how it's pronounced, that cap or that hood that the monks do wear that does relate back. There's certain color schemes that seem to be popular tropes. Of course, black, white, and red are usually the colors associated with this kind of thing. And you see that in Freemasonry as well. So a lot of these things have been carried forward. Usually they like aprons. They like different articles of clothing like that. So a lot of this has been adopted by the modern day secret society groups and brought forward. So we have these different articles of clothing, the hoods, the caps. A lot of those have been used by the alchemists and stuff too. The cap
Mm,
is a popular thing with the alchemists. So
yeah.
that's actually where the term cappuccino comes from, by the way. The capuchin cap that was worn by many of the alchemists. So because the foam on top of the coffee kind of looks a
Yeah.
little bit like that cap. So that's how that got its name, and it's interesting how it has affected our modern culture in that way. So yeah, there are little bits of the dress code there. I know in ancient Egypt they used to wear the symbol of the snake on their forehead. You might have seen that the pharaohs wore the little snake on their forehead. So that was part of it as well. That's kind of fallen away in the modern era, in my view, but this was an important thing tied back to Egypt as well. So we have these different articles of clothing that have kind of been associated back to that. So the apron is probably the most important one. That's the most important one to Freemasons. And of course, you could argue all day long where they got that from. They'll claim it comes from the old operative Mason groups, the ones that were actually practicing stone cutting and stone carving and that kind of thing. They used it to keep their tools in. And of course, well, you could tie all that back even further than that. It just seemed
Mm,
like a practical place for them to adopt some of the Mason guilds, the stone guilders, kind of symbolism. They've adopted a lot of that and encapsulated it into their own belief systems. So they
mhm,
use it as a practical kind of facade to put their esoteric teachings on. So they claim
mhm,
they come from the ancient stone crafters and stuff like that, and they use a lot of the handshakes which the ancient stone cutters used to identify their knowledge to the foremen and stuff there, so that they understood how skilled they were at the craft and this kind of thing. And this was before allegedly written writing and before a lot of people knew how to read. So they had to use this special handshake to identify themselves as craftsmen of the highest order so that it was understood by the foremen what they were capable of and this kind of thing. And this is where the Freemasons claim to get a lot of their ritualistic standards and stuff from, like the handshakes and all of that. So they claim that comes from the operative Masons guilds, and that's probably where they claim that the apron comes from. But the apron does go back further than that. It's always been an important piece in the esoteric because it's a covering of the holy of holies. It covers the crotch area. It covers the generative force. This is what these people are all about. So when you think of the
sex and
generative,
drugs and rock and roll.
yeah, pretty much. But they've adopted it and they claim, okay, it comes from these craftsmen. Okay,
Mm,
that's the exoteric version that they give the public. When you go back
mhm,
and you look at the esoterica involved with it, that's what it's really about. It's the covering of the holy of holies. It's the veil that covers the holy of holies. If you want to get down to the brass tacks of what it is they're talking about with all of that,
mhm,
so you could trace back these symbols even back as far as this Brotherhood of the Snake too, because a lot of the symbolism, the archetypes, they're all present as far back as you go. You find them everywhere. They just might have different explanations for things or different types of descriptive terms that they use for these things, but it's all the same teachings in all of these secret society groups, and they all derive from somewhere. And as far back as we could look is this Brotherhood of the Snake. So there you go.
yeah. But isn't it interesting? Every time a male rises up into positions of power, all of a sudden he finds himself with items of female attire, the apron, um, the robes of the judges, um, the cardinal. Yeah. So that has always puzzled me. You know what I mean?
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. Do you know what that really is? You want to hear what that really is from their own teachings? And this is what they teach in the secret society groups. They teach that where the real power lies is on the female side of God, the
Mm-hmm.
feminine aspect, the divine feminine. That's why they hearken unto this divine feminine. That's why they have their drag shows at Bohemian Grove. That's why they do this kind of stuff. It absolutely has everything to do with that, and that's what the magicians will tell you. All of these occultists and magicians, they'll tell you that the real power can be found in the female side of God or the Godhead. And that's why they hearken to these feminine ideas. And that's why these men who arise to these positions of power, well, this is what they use to try to hearken into that power. They hearken upon this divine feminine aspect in order to bring about balance in themselves and their spirits and to align with their will. You see, it all ties back to this notion of will. Now, will is a masculine principle. Imagination is a feminine principle. And when you look at these things from the old alchemical viewpoint in that way, we have this dynamic across the board all the time with all of this, and it all ties back to the masculine and the feminine. It's the whole duality principle behind everything, you see, and that's one of the big secrets that they keep at the topmost levels of these secret societies, or so they claim. Now, whether that's true or not, can't say for 100% certain, but that is why they like to use these more feminine types of articles of clothing when they arise to these high levels of power or these high positions in society. That's why, because it said that's where the power lies, is on the female side or the feminine principle in the Godhead. So that's what they're trying to leverage. There you go. So, in case you never heard that from anybody before, now you know.
Yeah, I always suspected that there is a lot of goddess worship going on that is not officially displayed or explained. You know what I mean? Because when you look at it from the outside, it is male dominated. But then when you go into the symbolism, even um, some churches, they remind me of a female breast. Yeah, you even find that with yeah, Buddhist temples. Sometimes they are built in the same way. So or you even find it on the yeah, but that would be the Venus cult. The Muslim flag, the green color of Venus, and the star is also Venus. Yeah, so yeah,
Yep, and that's the Isis archetype, the Isis
yeah,
principle. If you go back to the Egyptian and see, it always harkens back to these Egyptian teachings. That is where many of these mystery schools claim that the mystery schools themselves, the mysteries, found their perfection in the Egyptian mythos, in that symbolism there, where they had the best representations of these ideas. And that's why these secret society groups of today harken back to that. So this is the Isis principle they're invoking. Of course, what was known about Isis? Well, she was the goddess of magic. You see, magic always associated with Isis. And a symbol that's important that relates back to this Isis principle, of course, is the owl. Did you really think that that big owl at Bohemian Grove was representing Moloch or some such thing? No, that's a misnomer that was put out to throw the public off the trail. It's Isis. It's a representation of Isis. It's the divine feminine. Why do you think these guys have their massive drag shows there too? It really, it harkens back to all of this. And this is not me saying this, just for people out there, so you know. I'm not saying this. This is what the magicians at the highest, most levels in these occult fraternities and secret society groups will tell you, that the power can be found in this divine feminine principle, the feminine side of God. And that's what they seek to tap into. So this, once again, harkens back to that teaching of Aleister Crowley, do as thou will is the whole of the law. But there's another aspect to that, because you see, the will being a masculine principle, it needs to have its balance in the feminine principle, which of course is imagination. So you have will and imagination, and you can't have generation or a generative force without will and imagination. So you cannot create something new. You cannot have the divine power of generation without both sides of it. And that's one of the big secrets of the magicians. And that's why we see so much screwing around in society with the divine feminine and the divine masculine principles, with the masculine and the feminine in particular. That's why we have all of these androgynous type notions being thrown around, because androgyny in the occult perspective of things represents this balance of the feminine and the masculine. And that's why they're really pushing these things on a physical material world paradigm level today. It harkens back to these ideas. It's a perversion of these ideas and these archetypes that are present. And it
Yeah,
has
and
to
these
do with the dark
days,
occultists that run things.
yeah, and these days when anybody can become anybody, tomorrow you can declare you are a woman. I can declare I am a man. And yeah, it's just, it piles up with the confusion. And
And certainly it does. And there's a reason for that, because, well, that gives them a way to leverage these principles and these powers against people if they're in this state of confusion. And this causes actually the antithesis of what the claim is in occultism. You see, in occultism, the androgynous, this combination of feminine and masculine principles, represents balance. Well, what this does is this creates an unbalance in the natural energetic principles of things. So it's a completely artificial contrivance against how things operate in the natural order. So it creates the inversion principle. And that's essentially what these dark occultists at the top of the power structure seek to do in this world. They want to completely invert all of the natural principles here, a complete
yeah,
inversion process. And that's the true definition of true Satanism, the inversion principle. And that's what they hearken upon all the time. So they will claim one thing and then do the complete opposite. So the claim is androgyny within occultism represents balance between the feminine and the masculine. And they roll that out on the culture. And what it does is it creates a greater imbalance, and it creates confusion, and it creates controversy, and it creates tension, and it creates all of these different problems in society that were not intended. Now, there's always been a very small percentage in the world that has historically existed in that paradigm. But what we're seeing today is an unnatural push for this thing. It's a propaganda campaign to promote this thing. And it causes people who wouldn't normally fall into that category to explore that category. And this has everything to do with transhumanism. Absolutely. Wish it didn't, but it always does. And I always say this, and I sound like a broken record. Everywhere I go, I always wind up in one of two places, the occult and or transhumanism, because that is the big granddaddy conspiracy going on in the world today that underlies everything. It's transhumanism. It leads to this notion of transhumanism. Transgenderism is just a precursor state for transhumanism. End of story. So if you get nothing else from this talk today, understand that, and it'll be all good.
yeah. I mean, yeah, because if you no longer know who you are and what you are, and if you are so confused, then it's probably easier to talk you into merging with the machine.
Absolutely. And that's the whole notion. I mean, this could give you multi-bodied experience. It could give you uh, immortality. If you could upload your consciousness into a machine, you could have a virtual body. You can have a holographic body. You could transfer your consciousness into any container you want. You could be whatever you want. You could be a purple panda for all anybody cares, if you'd really like. And that would be totally fine in this new world that they plan on building, this digital amalgamation that they plan on building. Of course, that's all based on lies and manipulations, though, too. And it's actually, at the end of the day, the whole thing's a massive eugenics program, a massive eugenics depopulation plan. But they will try their very best to convince you that you can live on in a machine if you would like. But my take on this is it's all a lie.
Yeah, of course it is a lie. And yeah, but okay, let them. I'm not
I know
going
it
to
sounds like we veered a
say.
little off topic, right? But it's absolutely where things are headed, though.
Yeah. So, believe it or not, our first hour is already gone. So yeah, that was the public hour, and we will see the patrons on the other side.